All right. I'm gonna get started. So I'm generally gonna talk about this in two parts. So this is the writing and breaking a new AFF elective. And I'm gonna generally approach this in two pieces. The first part is the stuff that you can do before the debate, which is gonna be most of the elective because I think that that's actually way more important than stuff that happens during the debate. And then the second shorter part is I'm gonna kind of break down and give some pointers speech by speech. All of you can feel free to interrupt me at any point with questions, either by just like unmuting yourselves when I have a pause in my talking, or you can feel free to use the Zoom chat and I'll be keeping tabs on it throughout this thing. So don't be shy, ask questions. Want this to be more of a conversation. Happy to divert. I don't really have a script. I'm just like, I have some talking points, but I'm kind of just going to ramble and say the stuff that I think is the most important. And then you all can feel free to interrupt or divert me if you have any specific questions that you would like addressed. So the stuff that I'm going to say is also, this is kind of just how you should think about the advice I'm going to give. Not all of it is going to be relevant in every debate because in a lot of new AF debates, you might be debating a team that is just dramatically worse than you. So some of the strategic considerations that are at play aren't really as significant. There might be just some situations where you do the opposite and it seems like it's better, like actively better than the advice that I would have given. But the pointers that I'm giving here are kind of things that work better most of the time. They're general best practices, which, if the other team is doing something wrong, you can also do stuff that's wrong or suboptimal and punish the other team for their mistakes. But the advice that I'm giving here is advice that is going to serve you well when you're debating some of the best competitors, right? So it's like you can take shortcuts a certain percentage of the way, but at a certain point you have to rely on just like generally advisable best practices, and you have to cultivate those skills before you actually need to deploy them against the very best opponents in the country. So that's kind of the approach that I would, the thing that I would keep in mind here is these might, the payoffs might not be beneficial in like the 2-4 part of the bracket or whatever, but if you want to ultimately deploy these strategies successfully, you should begin to cultivate them as soon as possible so that you can, be good at them when it actually comes time and your debate career potentially depends on whether or not you win against one of those best opponents. Another thing to note is that some of the stuff that I'm saying is generally accepted advice, but some of the stuff that I'm saying is also not quite as generally accepted because I have a particular style and perspective on this stuff. So it's not like you shouldn't treat it as gospel or anything. You should take in alternative perspectives and adapt what I'm saying to your specific approach to research, your specific argumentative preferences, whatever. But just kind of things to keep in mind. So why write new arguments? So this is kind of the hardest position for the neg to be in, right? Because the neg is targeting a specific thing, and you, whenever you switch it up, are throwing a wrench into their preparation through something unpredictable. 2Ns are generally not as good in new situations as they are in situations that they've prepared for. And especially when you've prepped the new AF correctly and you've built your new AF to target the exact thing that the neg is going to go for, that can put the neg in a really, really rough spot because it enhances your answers in a way that they did not necessarily predict. The implication of that is a lot of this advice can inform how you write and break an entirely new affirmative, but it's also advice that you should be implementing at literally every single tournament that you go to. Because when you go to a tournament and you read the same 1AC that you were reading before, you're giving up an option to throw a wrench in the works of the neg team. This can be minor tinkering. It could be switching out an impact scenario for a different impact scenario. It could be reading an entirely new advantage. It could be reading a slightly different plan mechanism that garners a slightly different set of reasons why it's good, or a slightly different set of reasons why it's better than a core topic generic counterplan. So you should always be switching it up as a 2A. Your goal should be kind of to make it as difficult as possible for the neg to see you as a stable target. And this might seem like it's a lot of work, and it might seem like it's not attainable for someone who goes to a small school or for someone who doesn't have a lot of resources. I would argue that it's actually much more important to do this if you're a small school or if you don't have a lot of resources. And the returns that you can get on it are actually way greater in that situation. The reason for that is that you can coast under the radar to a certain degree because you're not really in people's sights necessarily, but each time you break something new, if you're a small school that does the new stuff, then no one will ever do negs against you just because it's not worth it. They know that you're going to break new stuff over time, and you might not be on the top of their kill list or whatever. So you can always kind of coast underneath and make it so nobody ever has anything specific to say against you. Especially when, in high school to begin with, the baseline of how much research people do and how many arguments prep is much lower than in college. But some of the people who use this to the most effective advantage in college even went to small schools that do not have a ton of coaching resources or a ton of coaching depth. For example, Georgetown, on a year when Ezra Luvis and Natalie Knez were their top team, didn't have all that many coaches, surprisingly. You might think of Georgetown as like a tank program. Historically they have been at times, but at this point in their history, they did not have like a very deep bench of coaches. They had like one or two people, and that's like relatively small for a college program. But Ezra Luvis, the 2A, read 14 Fs his senior year. So it's totally insane, right? I mean, obviously it helps the fact that he had an insane work ethic and he was a super smart guy, but like he was able to take advantage of that, and nobody was ever able to get, to effectively target him. And I think they actually ended up being ranked the second team in the country during the regular season, despite the fact they didn't have a ton of resources, just because the Ezra AFF juggernaut was just so unstoppable and nobody could ever like pin them down or prep a specific strategy against them, because he would like break a new AFF on them in round 4 of some like random tournament during the regular season. So even if you're a small school, you can get an enormous advantage out of doing this. So the first thing that you need to do when you're going into this conversation is you need to choose your AFF. And there's a lot of functions that go into, there's a lot of kind of steps that go into doing this. And I would argue that choosing your AFF is one of the most important steps. Like, because regardless of how well you write your AFF, some ideas just are not going to have a very good angle against a particular approach, right? It's like, if you read an advantage that does some small, if you read an AFF that reads a small technical tinker to the criminal justice system to solve something that you claim is racist, the ceiling in how good you can be against the abolition K is low. It just is. There's like, you can improve to some degree with some fancy preparation, but ultimately just like structurally the AFF you have chosen is not very well set up to debate this approach. If you're reading an AFF that preempts a state activity to solve some kind of impact, you're just not going to be that well set up against states and federalism, because the states will be able to change whatever activity you're preempting, and the federalism dissent is going to link. You get impact and federalism in your advantage, but again, then what's the point of reading the new AFF, because you're just having an impact turn debate. So again, it's like choosing the AFF, ideally, will give you a good angle against some of these general approaches. There's also some differences between the specific purpose that you want to write your AFF for. And you always want to be choosing your AFF with a specific purpose in mind. One thing to think about is, are you doing this at the end of the season or at the beginning of the season? So the purpose for which you're writing AFFs at those two different times are very different. At the beginning of the season, you kind of want an AFF with legs, right? You want an AFF that can go the distance. You want an AFF that has some diversity of advantage mechanisms, because you want to implement the thing I was saying earlier and switch it up from tournament to tournament. You want to not have to break a bunch of new AFFs in the middle of the season because it turned out that the AFF you started the season with is terrible and you can't win a debate with it, right? So in my 2A career, my approach has typically been to start off the AFF with a big core of the topic thing and just write it better than everyone else. So my last 2 years of debate, for most of the year on the healthcare topic, I read a single pair affirmative, which was the biggest affirmative on the topic. And on the executive power topic, I read the no first use affirmative, which was also one of the biggest affirmatives on the topic. But the reason I did that was because there's a lot of cards about those things. There's a lot of different advantages that we could read. And we just wrote a bunch of different advantages instead of breaking new AFFs. And that was the way that we switched up over the course of the season. But the benefit that had was that it allowed us to bank up all these other AFFs that I was writing and save them for the end, which is also something that you probably want to do because you probably care the most about the tournaments that are at the end. So you want to save your resources for those. If you're writing an AFF for the end of the year, though, the approach that you should take should be a little bit different. For one, you might literally be writing an AFF for one debate. This is the idea of the good for one, the GFO. This is a very different type of affirmative than the type of affirmative that you expect to read multiple times. For one, that you're expecting the neg to go into the debate without a case neg. You're expecting this affirmative to never face the scrutiny of a team that has thought about it before, right? So there's certain shortcuts that you can get away with a good for one that you can't get away with a not good for one. For example, if the affirmative is substantively a terrible idea, but it is a terrible idea for some super technical reason that one would have to have a lot of cards to demonstrate, if it's a good for one, you generally don't have to worry about that, because the chances that they have cut that specific case neg and can demonstrate that specific flaw with your affirmative with evidence is going to be very low. So good for ones can be good against generics, but bad against specifics, and that can be fine because they won't have the specifics prepped out to as great of a degree. Another thing to consider about beginning versus end of the year stuff is judging. And this is something that is a little bit under-evaluated by people, but judging has some implications that matter a lot for what affirmative you can pick. The main judging tendency, I would say, between the regular season versus the end of the season is in the regular season, you get a lot of high school judges. You're going to primarily tournaments that are attended by a lot of high school people, whereas if you're attending a national tournament at the end of the year, you're going to get a lot more college judges who have some things in common between them. They have a high requirement of evidence quality, so they care more about the cards that you read rather than your spin. They are not as familiar with the topic, so they're going to be relying on those cards much more to form their idea of what the topic is and what the distribution of arguments is. And whatever topic preconceptions people come away from camps with, those judges probably don't know what those preconceptions are unless they worked at one of those camps. There are many people who just work as college coaches, and then they show up to like the Tournament of Champions or whatever, or the NDCA tournament, and they have no idea what the topic is. So if someone presents a topicality argument, whereas, if you went to a camp and, you're just like, you're really scared of T and act because you're like really worried about the definition of an act, and everyone kind of agrees that T and act is really good. It might be the case that if you show up to the Tournament of Champions and you're judged by a college judge who has no exposure to the topic, that judge has no idea if T and act is actually good, right? So they are going to, whereas one judges, if you read a courts after in front of a high school judge, they might immediately start thinking to themselves, it's like, oh, T and act, it's like really good. College judge isn't going to think that because they have no idea. They might not even know what the resolution says. So it's like, that's both an opportunity and a liability, because on one hand, it's like you need to communicate a little bit more, you have to unpack concepts a little bit more, but it also means you can take some gambles. You can do things that the community might have decided, according to conventional wisdom, are not wise or are not topical, and you can get away with it a lot more because those judges have not really internalized those preconceptions. Another thing to consider is how many affirmatives you're going to write. So you might have to read an affirmative multiple times despite prepping for the end of the season, just because you're not going to write that many. If you think 2 is how much you can read, that's like maybe you're writing 1 to clear and you're writing 1 to read in the elims, right? Those affirmatives are going to have to be a little bit better than good for ones because you're expecting those affirmatives to face some scrutiny. So how airtight your affirmatives are also has to kind of depend on how many rounds you anticipate having to read them. So those are some general considerations. How do you apply those to a specific thing, and how do you actually come up with an idea? So the first thing that you need is inspiration. And inspiration for an affirmative is something that is going to come a little bit more naturally as you progress through your debate career and you've just been exposed to way more proposals and you kind of have a better mental idea of how stuff works. But there are some exercises that you can do and some practices that you can do that can make the inspiration thing happen faster. So the first step is to gather a bunch of data, like as much as possible. What are other teams saying? What are your particular opponents likely to say against you? Who are you targeting here? What are their 2NRs? What are people's, what angles to the topic are people taking in general? The reason you want to do this is because it will inform what I call area mapping exercises. And this can be a relatively time-consuming and research-intensive endeavor that in my debate career, I typically did over winter break because in college, there's like a pretty well-defined like beginning of the year block of tournaments and then a pretty defined like end of the year block of tournaments. And there's a gap between like the end of November and like the second week of January where just nothing is happening. There's like 6 weeks of just like downtime. And what I typically do during that downtime is I will look at specific topic areas and just try to read a bunch about those areas to figure out what approaches are people proposing and how are people approaching a variety of different controversies. And this is coupled with intensive note-taking and like even cutting cards that at this point don't have a clear purpose, because I'm literally just trying to figure out like how the literature base meshes together, what angles are people taking, and what genres of answers to stuff exist. The reason I'm doing this is that I will couple it with this data that I've collected, which is like, suppose that the primary problem that I need to solve going into the end of season tournament is that the court's counterplan is really good. If I go into a debate, I'm highly likely to face a strategy that is dependent on the agent. It's probably going to be the court's counterplan, right? So we have some ideas from camp about what arguments are generally good against the court's counterplan, but specific areas of the literature might engage with the court's counterplan in a different way that your opponents might not have anticipated. So we've talked a lot in AFF conversations that we've had across all of our labs about the idea of courts probably being able to enforce stuff less. So potentially congressional noncompliance is an area that we've explored. But based on the AFFs that I've looked at so far, it seems like an area that we haven't really explored is the idea of funding stuff. If a reform requires funding, then if the courts do it, courts don't have the power of the purse, so they're not going to be able to implement it. An area in which a lot of people have explored that, describes how the federal government can make the states do stuff is the idea of spending conditions or the spending power. Is this something that has come up for people? Thumbs up if it's come up for you, because nobody has their camera on. Thumbs? Only a little bit of thumbs. So people should explore this, because it is an interesting approach to answering the court's counterplan that would come up in your area mapping exercise. So this idea of the spending conditions is the way that the federal government can primarily make states do stuff in the area of law enforcement and policing is by saying, we're giving you a bunch of money, we will cut it off if you don't do a particular set of reforms. This is not a mechanism that is available to the courts. The courts are also not able to provide financial support to states that do what the counterplan wants them to do, or what the AFF wants them to do. So let's say the AFF is like, we want to get police to do something super expensive, right? We want to make police better at, cracking down on drug trafficking, for example. So this is already an approach that is kind of going opposite of the topic, because we're reforming the criminal justice system in a direction that is more harsh. So we're already going to have a built-in answer to the abolition K. We're going to have some built-in answers to things like soft on crime links to politics. So we have some tricks that are built in through that approach intrinsically. If we also can say that's something super intensive that Congress can provide financial support for states, and on top of that, that financial support is the mechanism by which we're incentivizing states to comply with stuff. If they read the court's counterplan, they can't replicate that, because if the courts demand that the states do something differently, they can't provide financial support. So that's just an example of what I'm talking about, but there's a lot of different subgenres of solvency deficits to all the core topic counterplans that they might matter for some affirmatives, right? But they won't matter for other affirmatives as much. Like the spending deficit is not going to matter for a lot of the affirmatives that we've written so far. Like it's not going to matter at all, obviously, for like the death penalty act, which is like that could be fine. Like there could be other answers to that counterplan that are built into that affirmative. But the point I'm getting at is that there are different approaches that each substantive area of the topic takes to each of the core topic generics. And that is a thing that you can consider in your area mapping process. Some ideas to help with this are, so like, obviously there's a lot of disads. Like the NAG has been innovating a bunch to try to figure out a way to get offense. One way that you can start this process off is by thinking about how you can link turn disads. So a benefit of doing this, beyond just jogging the creative process here, is trying to figure out like how you can catch the NAG off guard, since the NAG is going to be very reliant on their core topic disads. They're going to be assuming that their core topic disads are going to link. But this is an area where the death penalty affirmative shines, for example, because a lot of the death penalty research is speaking to the issue of federalism, and it's saying that the federal government is currently preempting the states through the federal death penalty. So that's an example of a way that while typically the AFF is going to have to say they're bad for federalism because they want to change some behavior that's happening at the state level, Here, we're getting rid of federal preemption. So it's the opposite direction of the topic for the core topic generic. And that creates a great built-in answer to the state's counterplan, to federalism disad, and you can read that advantage as a link turn to throw the negative off their game. And, you know, the other benefit of this, obviously, is it gives you a huge time advantage, because if they do read this strategy, you have already presented all this evidence in the 1AC, you can save a bunch of 2AC time. So, first step, inspiration. Once you have an inspiration, the next thing you need to do is you need to write a proof of concept. So this entails an A to A plus card for the mechanism or advantage that you want to write, a clear explanation of what your affirmative is or what your vision for it is, and a demonstration of the fact that it's serving some strategic purpose. So, you know, you've done your inspiration process with some specific strategic angles in mind, like you want to beat the court's counterplan, you want to beat the state's counterplan. So in your proof of concept phase, you want to do some research that illustrates that it is possible for the affirmative to beat these things. At this step, you primarily want to be, you know, demonstrating to yourself that the weaknesses of the affirmative that are potential weaknesses are not actually weaknesses. So, for instance, you know, if you are worried that an affirmative can't have advantages, you don't need to like write the full advantage to prove to yourself that an advantage exists. All you need to do is do the bare minimum at this point to demonstrate that an advantage exists. You don't need to like write all the impacts of that advantage, because you're just trying to figure out if it's viable at this point. So once you've proven to yourself that it exists, you know, you have to, and like another thing that's important about this step is you have to do it to a particular standard as well. So it's like, it helps to have a card that says, you know, it gestures at the notion that the states might be worse at the plan than the federal government. But when you're reading a new AF, you should not be reading a new AF that has like a 50-50 shot against a core of the topic strategy when you're debating one of the best teams with the best cards. You want to be overwhelmingly ahead. You want to make it so it's not just like one is marginally better than the other. You want to make it so the core topic generics literally just don't work. So like, for example, I don't know, it's like some of you went to the GDS part of this, but like when I wrote the FISA AF, when I was going into the GDS part of this camp, it was a federal policing AF that was designed to primarily address the anxiety of the state's counterplan existing. And that AF was written in such a way, it targets a federal policing activity, it targets something the states have no jurisdiction over. That's an example of what I'm talking about, where like you could, it's, you know, it's not an example of when you just have cards that distinguish between states and the feds at the margins, like, oh, you know, the feds are a little bit more efficient, or like, oh, you know, states are really difficult to coordinate or whatever. This is an example of what I'm talking about, where the state's counterplan literally doesn't work. There is no state's text that you could write that would even be plausible for a judge to vote on, right? Does that make sense? Okay. So you've gotten your inspiration, you've written your proof of concept, you've demonstrated that your AF serves the strategic purposes that you want. Now, the step that follows that is you want to actually write your AF. So as you're going into this step, it's important to have some idea of what the basic material that is required for a new affirmative is. The reason for that is that I think a lot of people limit how many new AFs they can do by over-prepping. This is certainly a thing that I did, because I would be like, I need like 1 AR blocks to regneg. Otherwise, I'm like too work, because like, you know, what if they read regneg and I'm not going to have anything to say? It's like, you know, this janky process counterplan that never comes up, and like never actually had a regneg debate in college, but I'm like worried about it. If you approach AF writing with that perspective, it's like, that's going to be way too much work. You're not going to be able to get the appropriate amount of mileage out of each increment of your new affirmative prep work. So you need a list of stuff that you need specific answers to, and you have to have a realistic idea of what it is that if you don't actually end up writing specific answers to it, it's fine and you can rely on your generic answers. So random janky process counterplans, great example of a thing that you don't need specific answers to for your AF generally, a lot of the time. It's like, that's obviously different if those process counterplans are core topic generics, or if the teams that you're planning on breaking this AF against rely on those. But, you know, triage, you can't prep to an equal degree against everything. Things that should be on your list for sure are obviously the topic generics. And I would argue that T violations are one of the most important things that you need to invest a lot of prep time into thinking about. Just because T debates are inherently a little bit of a crapshoot. It's going to be subjective based on the judge's assessment of what the topic is, which you're not always going to be able to predict, especially if they don't have a record of judging on the topic and you don't really know what their thoughts are. You like haven't talked about them. You don't know them as a person or anything. So T debate's inherently very risky whenever you're breaking a new affirmative. So T is something that you should over prep, I would say, in addition to all of that other stuff. The important determining factor of what goes on that list is kind of your idea of what your game plan is for winning the AF debate once it has started. So you want to approach this by thinking about like, okay, so I have my AF, it's designed to beat the state's counterplan. What 2AC do I want to be giving against the state's counterplan? And the answer to that question should stem from the question, what 2AR do I want to be giving against the state's counterplan? And then once you've answered that question, you can work backwards from there. How do I set up this 2AR with 1AR argument choices? How can I facilitate those 1AR argument choices by structuring my 2AC? And there's a lot of potential answers to that could inform both your specific 2AC block rating. It can inform as far back as your advantage choice, right? Because certain solvency deficits are going to be better connected to certain advantages, right? So as an example, the FISA affirmative that I wrote for the Georgetown camp, its answer to the question of agent key, so its answer to why Congress was key, was based on solving some political perception stuff. So if my whole AF had been built around like the FISA, like surveillance is super unjust now and the plan fixes it, that would not be very well connected with my arguments for why Congress is key. So I knew that my answer to agent counterplans was based on this political thing. So I needed to build my advantages backwards by also making my advantages be about political perception-y stuff. Does that make sense? Okay. So the other thing that you should be doing at this step, and really at every step, is you should be consistently reevaluating your stuff as you go. So there's basically no point at which it's too late to scrap what you're doing. Because it's better to scrap an AF that's 90% of the way done that you realize at the 90th percentile has some fatal flaw than to be like, it's fine, read that 90% completed AF, and then just get popped because the neg figures out what that fatal flaw is. It'll feel bad to jettison an AF that is that far done, but the other thing to remember is that even if you do a lot of AF work that doesn't manifest itself in an AF strategy, none of that work is wasted. For one thing, if someone reads that AF against you, you can now pop them by exploiting the fatal flaw that you just identified. Also, any prep work that you do for an AF can help inform future strategy development. So like an AF can give you ideas for future counterplans. An AF can give you ideas for future disad angles. This can all come out in the area exploration part, or you might not figure it out until you delve a little bit more deeply into stuff. But none of this work is wasted work. So you should not feel bad about jettisoning stuff that you've worked a lot on, because all of that stuff is ultimately going to be useful. There's two general last things that I want to say about writing the AF before I move on to suggestions for how to deploy the AF in the actual debate. The first general last thing is that your process of new AF writing should be collaborative to the extent that it's possible. And I don't necessarily mean you need to divide up labor or like multiple people need to work on the new AF. I mostly just mean you need to have a sounding board. So you need to have a person or group of people that you go to and you say stuff to them and you trust their opinion on, like, you say stuff to them, and then if they're like, you sound like you're high, that doesn't make any sense, then you like believe them, and then you can like use that as a valuable barometer of like, oh, I actually need to like rewrite something because this doesn't make any sense. So for me, even through when I was in college, I used my high school coaches a bunch for this. I used my partner for this. I used my college coaches for this. I would be like, hey, I would like send them a tag for the 1AC that I had mapped out. And I would be like, hey, does this make sense? Like, is this a sentence that you can follow? And they would be like, no, like, what in the world is this stupid acronym that you're using 4 times? Like, and then I would be like, oh, you know, you're right. Like, this isn't actually obvious to people who haven't been reading about this for the past 4 weeks. I should probably unpack it a little bit more. And that's the kind of insight that you can get out of it. I actually often even use my family for this. And my family are like relatively, you know, they're non-debate people. Like my younger brother is like, he's like in high school. He's like your age. He did debate for 1 semester and then quit because he didn't like it. But even after that, I would like send him an idea for a 1AC tag. And I would be like, hey, like, do you like follow what this is saying? And he would be like, no, like, I have not read about your topic. So I have no idea what this is talking about. And that's good feedback because your judges might also not have read about the topic. So if somebody who is a complete layperson is like, this is ridiculous, I don't know what you're saying, then potentially you have some space to work. All of those areas are viable candidates for sounding boards. So the other thing, and this is a very important ingredient of kind of being successful in the debate that needs to happen before the debate, is you have to practice your AF. You have to practice it. You are literally, it's like you are shooting yourself in the foot by reading a new AF if the first time that you're reading that AF is in the actual debate. I think this is one of the biggest differentiating points between new AF horror stories where the AF gets clobbered and new AF success stories where the AF has a well-developed and well-executed plan of action. Part of the reason why you want to practice it is for the same reason why you want a sounding board. There might just be spots that you've missed that are weaknesses that you haven't realized are actual weaknesses. For example, you might not have written a core 2AC block. When I was a freshman, it was the climate change topic, and one of the core counterplans on the topic was the AF was supposed to regulate a company, and then one of the neg generics was the government should throw money at that company to like bribe it to do stuff that is cleaner, basically. General incentives counterplan, and there was like a business confidence net benefit that went with it. And so one of the key things that like every new AF that you read had to have was a reason why regulating was important rather than bribing. And I wrote like 7 new AFs or something for that NDT. And one of the new AFs that I had written, I was really hyped about, but it was like really complicated. And it was like a tricky thing about like electricity markets and like electricity futures. And I was really hyped. It was round 1. We were going to break this AF against Michigan State. And the panel, like none of the people on the panel had judged me before, but I was like, I thought I was hot shit. You know, I was like a freshman. I was pretty excited about this NDT. I thought, you know, everyone like has to know what I've been doing, obviously, but like none of these judges, like none of them cared about anything that I had done over the course of the season. I had like done this stupid electricity market thing before. Everyone was just like, whatever. It's just like this Trufanov guy who's just reading this stupid thing. Nobody cares. And so when I presented this 1AC about like complicated electricity markets, all the judges were like, what are you talking about? MSU was like, okay, we don't understand any of this because none of it makes any sense, but it sounds like if you give power companies $1 billion, that fixes this. And I responded with like these cards with like equations in them and just like, here you go. It's like, I didn't even understand what I was talking about. I was just like rambling off the top of my head. And obviously we like instantly lost on a 3-0. All the judges were like, yeah, this 2AR you gave, don't know what you were saying. So back to the drawing board, guy. And I was like, and this is something that would have been very clearly exposed. The root of this problem was we had done 0 practice debates about this new version of the affirmative because I was too busy just like cranking out a bunch of them. And if I had given 1 practice 2AC where someone had asked me to present a 2AC to the incentives counterplan, and I responded with this like Dadaist, like word salad nonsense, someone would have been like, hey, like you need to redo this. And then I would have redone it, and then we would have avoided that problem. So ways that I would suggest practicing your AF debating before you go into the debate. You could, you know, it depends to some degree on what strategy exactly you're angling against. Something that's always going to be useful is you have someone throw together a list of 1NC arguments, like off case and just like tags of case answer cards, and you give it to AC. I'd recommend doing this 3 to 4 times for every new AF that you're going to break. Cross-X drills. You present the 1AC to someone. You have them cross-examine you about it for like 15 minutes. You know, that's something that is very important for boosting the level of polish in your answers. And it can also help expose some fundamental, more strategic issues that you need to address if you don't, in fact, have a good answer to a certain question. If you are worried about one particular strategy, like, for example, if you're trying to angle against the abolition critique, and you know that the other team goes for the abolition critique against new affirmatives, you would want to simulate a block on the abolition critique, and you would want to give a 1AR. Some of these are a little bit resource dependent, like you might not be able to come up with as good of an abolition critique block as they would be able to come up with, or, you know, it's like this part is a little bit coaching dependent, but you should, some of these are accessible no matter what. Like, you should obviously be giving 2 ACs to stuff regardless. And if you simulate a block, even if you have to do it yourself, and even if it doesn't perfectly mirror what's going to happen, it's still better than not doing it at all, just because you go through the motions a little bit. Your 1A gets some practice unpacking stuff. You get some sense of how long some blocks are. Like, maybe you threw in T and you wrote some 1AR blocks that were too long, and you can learn that by simulating some blocks. So those are some ideas for ways that you can practice your app before the first app debate actually happens. And I mean, this goes without saying, but obviously time your 1AC. It's very embarrassing if you show up to a debate and your 1AC is either too long or too short. So, because the 1AC is the one thing you have perfect control over, so your 1AC should be exactly how long it's supposed to be. Okay. That kind of concludes my before the debate section. Does anyone have any questions about that? Or,
what are the best ways to like over prep T debates, to like be over prepared for any T arguments that could come your way when breaking a new AFF?
Yeah, so the nice thing about T is that T is, I mean, I said it was a bit unpredictable just because there's a lot of factors that can go into deciding a T debate, but in a way, T debates are also some of the most predictable ones, because once you have anticipated what the arguments are going to be, there's not that many ways that a T debate can go. Like, if the neg is going for T enact, they are always going to make arguments about why agent debates are important. They're always going to make evidentiary precision arguments. It's like, those arguments are always the same. Their case list is going to look roughly the same. There's not that much variation substantively between T debates at the highest level, right? And so the implication of that is that T debates are almost unlike any other debate in that you can basically write out the 1AR in advance. Not in the sense of you should literally like write a script and then the 1A should stand up in the debate and read it, but like your blocks about the T1AR can be pretty extensive. And like, for example, let me show what I'm talking about here to illustrate. Okay, so this is one of the affirmatives that I prepped for my last NDT, and you'll notice like I'm playing it fast and loose a little bit with 2AC blocks. It's like I have some 2AC blocks to politics here. I have my link turn a little bit written out, but like don't really have a lot of impact answers, don't have a lot of the core, like don't really have great political capital key cards slated, because like I'm relying a little bit on my ability to pull stuff off during in-round preparation. Like, you know, not some, you know, counterpoint 2AC doesn't have any perm blocks or any theory blocks written into it, so it's like that kind of thing. I'm playing it fast and loose a little bit. Not the case with T at all. Full scripting going on. Lots of cards. Got like cards on my reasons to prefer. Got cards on what the core debates and the subject matter are. And then if you scroll down, I have like relatively written out stuff. I have like specific cards that I have slated, specific arguments about the counterinterpretation. And you'll notice that some of these, if you look a little bit more closely, they are anticipating some of the stuff that the neg might bring up in the case list, because I generally know what the case list is going to be, right? So kind of same deal here. I have some notes going on over here because I know exactly what stuff they're going to bring up, like this AF. And I have my objections written out to it. These are just my notes for me. I wasn't actually going to send them out, but like, does this kind of make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does.
Okay.
Uh, Truth, I had a question about how you prepare like specific like affirmatives against specific teams. I'm sure you did it a lot your last year, but what was your sort of process in constructing affirmatives for like a specific team?
So, I mean, the biggest thing that is more difficult about this at the high school level than at the college level, and at the college level, some of this is kind of like it comes a little bit more easily because at the college team there's very good open source and there's very free flowing information. A lot of scouting is very much facilitated, whereas people's wikis in high school are terrible. So it takes a little bit more scouting for you to figure out what a team's argumentative tendencies are. But like this affirmative that I just screen shared was written for 3 teams. It was written for UNLV, it was written for Georgia, and it was written for Cal. Those teams had a thing in common, which is that if you look at their 2 NRs against new affirmatives, they were all very good teams, so a lot of them debated new affirmatives a bunch. And the things that they responded to new affirmatives with was primarily the executive counterplan, a politics disad, the treaty counterplan, which was like it competed off of instead of pass a law, you pass a treaty, and the net benefit was a politics disad about the House, since treaties don't need to be voted on by the House. And Cal really liked elections, also. So that's kind of it's a very specific set of arguments. And so, what do you need to beat that set of arguments? All the links to those political arguments were about restricting Trump. So an argument that does not restrict Trump, so an AF that Trump agrees with, is really good. An argument that additionally can boost Trump's political capital or boost Trump's appeal in some way is also good, since the best politics dissads were about trading off with Trump's agenda. On top of that, it was important to have a good defense of the process, and it was important to have a good defense of the agent. So that's kind of the set of requirements that we're going into this with. So how do we find an area that Trump agrees with, but that Trump wants his own authority restricted on? So in the area mapping exercise that I did in the middle of the year, it emerged that Trump disagrees with a lot of executive power that he spins as having been abused by Obama. So that was kind of the germ of the idea, was maybe we can restrict something Obama did that Trump says he's not doing. Trump would then agree with that. It would make him look really good because it would be like Congress is agreeing with his fever dream conspiracy theory, right? Then you got a politics link turn kind of because Trump agrees with stuff. You like legitimize him, and then you also have an agent key component because if you have a politics related advantage, you can have a reason why Congress acting is critical to that. And so that's kind of how this AF came together, was we just validated a Trump conspiracy theory. And then that was the whole thing. And then Georgia went for politics and, went for a politics dissent that was based on Trump vetoing the AF. And we were like, no, because it's a Trump conspiracy theory. So why would he veto it? He made this up. So what are we talking about? And, we were able to win that way. Does that make sense? It's like it's very hard to answer this question as a general matter because the specific way in which this works is going to depend a lot on the data gathering stuff that you do and how that interacts with the area mapping exercise that I talked about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the example was very clear.
I have another question. What if you encounter a completely new T in round?
That should not happen to you.
Okay, because we kind of wrote a new T last year and then we lost 6 rounds pretty much. And I went for T every single 2NR, but then I was really confident in my definition, but then I lost every single round. So I was just wondering why.
Well, I think a thing that high school people do a lot just in general is people think about T arguments as T definitions, like you were saying. And part of this stems from the inane convention of naming T arguments after the author, as if just because one author says a T definition and then another author is saying the same T definition, that like somehow makes the T argument different, even though it doesn't. You should generally think about, from the AFF perspective at least, what aspects of your affirmative could the neg try to limit out? So on this topic, the neg can try to limit out the agent through enact, through the word the refers to the federal government collectively, which has to include Congress, through defining the federal government as a single unitary actor, saying that the entire federal government has to act, through substantial, because the neg could dream up like a random card that says substantial has to be Congress, right? So all of those sound like different T arguments because like one of them is T substantial, one of them is T enact or whatever, but they're not different T arguments. They're all saying the topic should be construed in such a way that requires the affirmative to have a Congress actor. So the answer to all of those T arguments is obviously supplemented through definition work that you do, but the answer to all of those T arguments is non-congressional actors should be part of the topic, right? As another example, on this affirmative that I showed on my screen, there was a prominent argument that year that restrict, which was in the resolution, means prohibit. So you can't regulate an activity, you have to ban the activity. There was also an argument that the phrase in the area, which was in that topic, means that it has to be the entire area. So you can't just regulate part of an area, you have to regulate the whole area. And so those seem like different T arguments, but I had one block to both of those T arguments, because both of those T arguments are actually saying you have to regulate, you have to affect the entire area. So I had one giant block that was like, here's my in the area definition, here's my restrict definition, and here's all of my reasons why the affirmative team should be allowed to talk about subsets of the topic. And if you think about topicality in those broader strokes, then you can both improve your T debating, because your T debating will be more grounded in what the appropriate vision of the topic is rather than nitpicking the relative quality of the cards. But also it will reduce the chances that you get caught off guard, because your prep is not contingent on they read a specific T definition from a specific author. It's contingent on you defending that your affirmative should be included in the topic, which is what T debates are ultimately all about.
Okay. I guess what we did was like we defined direct commercial sales, which is what the arms sales topic was about,
Yep.
to terms of art, which you have to change the CAT policy. So it ruled out like a lot of AFs, and then but we still lost like 6 rounds. So
Right. So like the AF probably said that that definition was arbitrary because they had a different definition that included their AF. And since they structured their preparation around including their AF, they were able to say including our AF is good. This definition that includes our AF is good. The type of restriction that you have to do to exclude our AF is bad. And then on top of that, nitpick your card. And I assume that is what happened to you.
okay. Thank you
And
so much.
that kind of preparation helps you kind of angle against it.
Thank you.
Other questions? Okay. I will wrap this up by rambling a little bit about specific speeches. So, 2 AC considerations. I'm mainly going to, well, okay. Actually, one thing I will mention before I move on to the specific speeches, thing that I forgot to say earlier, is that so many people break new AFs with impact turnable impacts. Like, people will break a new AF and they'll say that it solves the economy, or they'll say that it solves hegemony, despite the fact that DDEV and hegemony bad are arguments that are out there, and nearly all schools have a file that speaks to those questions. It is inconceivable to me why anybody would ever do this. You're breaking a new AF for the purpose of making it so the other team has nothing to say, right? And then you're giving them DDEV, which on the worst of days, it's like if they don't have a neg even to an AF that you've been reading this whole time, if they have DDEV, they're pretty happy. Like, DDEV is pretty good as an argument, right? And on top of that, it's like they already had nothing. And you were going to win by just them having nothing and them presenting a bunch of garbage. And all of a sudden, you have a relatively evenly matched debate about whether economic growth is good or bad. It doesn't make any sense to me. You should never, ever, ever do this. Whenever you present a new affirmative, your impact should always be stuff that they cannot impact turn. a thing to think about, just to frame that issue in your head, is you can lose on DDEV. You cannot lose on my impact was stupid. I mean, you can lose on it in conjunction with a disad, but you can't lose on the fact that you read a bad impact alone, right? So if you replace an economy impact that would have been in your 1AC with like US Civil War causes extinction, Pinkerton 2003, which was an impact that we read in this 1AC in the file that I just showed you against Georgia, right? If we'd read an economy impact instead of that thing, Georgia would have DDEV'd because they had nothing. They certainly would have just gone for economic growth as bad, and we would have had a relatively difficult debate on our hands. Instead, we read Pinkerton 3, which sucked. It had no impact on the debate, and they like made fun of it a bunch, but it was not important to our strategy at all because we were always just going to win by link turning the politics disad. So premium on narrowing the opponent's options is way higher than the premium on slightly improving the quality of your impacts. So that's a last ramble that I wanted to get out of the way about the 1AC before I talk about the 2AC. So 2AC on case should be a little bit different in a new affirmative debate than in a regular debate. Because in a normal debate, it's a relatively accepted thing. The judge is someone who's been exposed to the topic before. They generally know what you're talking about. You can be a little bit more blasé about what concepts you explain and what concepts you unpack than you would be normally. So in this situation, you need a little bit more explanation. This does not mean do the thing that a lot of people do, which is like read a random overview at the top of your case stuff. That sucks. You should not be reading overviews on case basically ever. What it does mean is when you're explaining your more complicated impacts, or when you're explaining potentially even a solvency deficit to a counterplan, you should unpack it a little bit more than you normally would and connect it a little bit more explicitly to 1AC cards, connect it a little bit more explicitly to 1AC vocabulary. A note about 2AC coverage. Oftentimes the neg will spam a bunch of stuff because they don't know what to go for. So they will just throw a bunch of stuff at the wall and see what sticks. So you need to focus primarily on identifying what the neg's best argument is and covering that. And then the question for the rest of the stuff is how little can I get away with answering it and still be fine? When we broke the affirmative that I showed, Georgia responded with, I believe, 8 off-case positions and a lot of stuff on case, including some offense. So it was not the easiest 2AC to give. But the only question that I had at play in my 2AC time allocation stuff was I want to read my entire 2AC block because I don't want to have a T debate, or I want to read my entire T2AC block because I don't want to have a T debate. And I want to read my entire 2AC block to politics in the state's counterplan, or in the executive counterplan, because I knew that they wanted to go for that stuff, and that was our kind of formula for winning the debate. The other stuff was like, they read the terrorism disad. I think I read like 2 cards about the terrorism disad and made some random analytic. I spent like 30 seconds because like I didn't care. Like the plan was designed to avoid the terrorism disad. There was no way they had an AFF specific link. I was kind of gambling a little bit, but the 1NC was kind of big, so I had to blow some stuff off. And the thing I decided to blow off was terrorism. You want to be making these decisions explicitly and on purpose, rather than having them be made for you by the fact that you attempt to read all of your 2AC blocks and you fail because you're not fast enough. You need to recognize how fast you are and make those decisions about prioritization explicitly, right? And this is also something that will be assisted by the fact that you've done some 2AC practice drills, so you have some general idea about what stronger negative positions are versus weaker negative positions. So a question that often comes up is how much block stuff do you need? And I kind of showed this a little bit earlier, but a new AF, I think you need probably less completed 2AC blocks than you do certainly for your normal AF. You don't need to replicate the level of preparation that you do for your normal AF every single time you break a new AF. It's useful primarily, it's like you have to remember what blocks are useful for. They're useful because they save you time and they reduce the chances that you make a mistake because they fill out the completed thing that you're saying in every situation, right? On certain stuff, like for example, you saw I didn't have a block to the P Club recommend counterplan. I just had some cards. the cards were all I needed because the cards unpack my AF's specific angle against that counterplan. And then I knew off the top of my head that I was going to make some permutations. I was going to make some theory arguments, whatever. Just when you're prepping before the tournament, there isn't the necessity to map out all of that stuff in advance. And in the debate, if you screw up, that's a risk that you're taking on. You should be relying on your partner to kind of check you to make sure that you don't screw up on that kind of thing. But you can dedicate some prep time in the debate to make that prioritization if a low probability counterplan that you only have a couple of cards about but not a complete block comes up. All right. Most of the stuff that I was going to say about the 1AR and the 2AR I actually kind of already said. So the main 1AR thing is make choices, write blocks about T, and set up the 2AR. And the 2AR, you should be generally attempting to give the strategy that you had planned to give before the debate that is the optimal winning strategy against the particular position that you've identified. But the advice that people often give with 2ARs that applies to new affirmatives more than ever is the strategy of starting off your speech with a very clear and compelling statement that conveys that you're confident of victory and ideally mirrors the thing that the judge starts off their ballot with. The reason it's more important here than a normal debate is because normal debates, judges typically have some muscle memory for how to reconcile competing arguments, whereas if you have successfully thrown a wrench into the works, you are ideally introducing some new reasons why the state's counterplan sucks, for example, that judges might not have thought of before. And so having a clear message at the top of the 2AR that is like, here is my solvency deficit to thing. It's massive, and it means that their counterplan does not rise to the threshold of solving X advantage. Ergo, the implication is this. You know, that kind of thing at the top of the 2AR is very helpful for conveying to the judge the strategy that you're going to use to win the debate. So in this debate against Georgia, I started off my thing by saying, the big trick of this AF is that we have written an affirmative that Trump really likes. And we have written it such that Congress needs to intervene in order to resolve the political impacts. So that fundamentally negates all of their strategy. It means none of their strategy applies. And then reasons. And then I kind of got into the thing. So that clearly conveys to all the judges. A, I have planned for this. B, Georgia has activated my trap card. So it's like everything that I have done, like all of this has gone according to my master plan. So like Georgia's screwed because I'm very smart. I'm a mastermind and I have envisioned everything that was going to happen. And then also the way that the debate has played out, I win for reasons. That communication is very important because the AF's different. Judges might not know what's going on. There might be some rep disbalance things. And that kind of messaging is very helpful at the top of the 2AR just to like kind of lock in that your strategy has worked and everything has gone according to the plan. And to be clear, Georgia is an extremely good team. I'm not attempting to banish them to the Shadow Realm. I'm just trolling. Also, I'm not saying read shitty impacts. I'm saying don't get impact turned. Boo, Aryan, boo. All right, I'm done rambling about speeches. I know I'm a little bit over time, so you all can feel free to go. If you don't, whatever. If you need to go, you should go. Any questions about anything, though?
Thank you.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I kind of had a question.
Yeah, what's up?
It was on like how could you force the negative to go into like a substance debate, like other than just like I guess like prep them out like complete over prep like T. Is there any other like tips that you could give that like how you could force the negative to go for substance? Because like I had this problem where like I read like a small AF and like they would just go for T every single time.
Well, so it's like there's some conflicting stuff going on for sure there. I mean, for one thing, you could never force the neg to do anything, obviously, because ultimately it is up to the neg. You can only kind of incentivize them to do stuff.
Yeah.
And so part of that stems from like at the very beginning, like before you do anything, it's like when you're doing your AF selection. The reason we did our AF selection against this slate of teams like, Cal, UNLV, Georgia, was because we knew that when they were going into a new AF debate, the pre-round discussion that they were having, it sounds like a lot of the time involved a reliance on politics and the executive counterpoint. So we weren't forcing them to go for substance. We were punishing the tendency that they had, right? Which is they had a pre-existing desire to go for substance. And from there, that's where some stuff, it's like, if they were not a team that was going to go for the executive and the executive counterpoint of the politics dissad, nothing we did would have, deterred them. It's like Kansas, for example, was also at that tournament, and they were just like wrecking people's stuff on T. They were like giving entire T, like they were giving a 9-minute T2 and C. That's like how they won the quarterfinals, I think. So it's like Kansas never would have gone for politics in this situation because they were just like committed to going for T. So it sounds like in your situation, you're debating teams that are reliant on T as their strategy to beat small AFs. So if you're breaking a new AF against a team that relies on T against small AFs, the pre-round thing or the AF choice thing that you should be thinking about is I should pick a topical AF, right?
Yeah. I guess like a follow-up question that I had is that like since there is no like, because like from what I've seen is that like there is no like definitive like there's like no clear definition on what substantial is in this topic. Should like I kind of like abuse that and like kind of like pick a really small app?
It does seem like you can be punished less on this topic for going small than you can be on some other topics. But I would caution you because substantial is not the only way to say that big Fs are good. You can also say big Fs are good by saying criminal justice reform needs to be comprehensive. There are cards that say that sentencing reform needs to be something that is sweeping or affects a lot of different crimes. So it is not necessarily the case that you're home free just because the word substantial is not very well defined in the topic. And on top of that, right, they can also win by defining substantial in non-quantitative terms. So like normally people win by being like, oh, it's at least 2%. Doesn't really make sense here, but they could say something like substantial means in the main. That's a very common substantial definition. And in the main, they could read cards that are like your AF is not a main part of the topic, so you should lose. And at the end of the day, the answer to all of those things is the AF should get to read small AFs. So the best way to beat any of that is just like deconstruct the premise. Be like, stop being lazy. Small AFs are good. Small AFs better than small negs because small AFs prevent the guaranteed big AF from losing to a bunch of picks. Whatever. It's like that kind of discussion is way more useful in that kind of debate. But again, if the team that you're debating is like they have demonstrated that all they go for against new affirmatives is T substantial or T you have to be a big AF, then don't read a small AF against them.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
Can you like give your input generally on just KFs and like what you should be prepared for?
Like when you're breaking a new KF?
Yeah.
Yeah, so like again, it depends on the opponent that you're breaking the new KF against, right? So obviously this is an area where I have a little bit less personal experience, but just like applying the general ideas of what I've talked about to the field of KFs, you have some insights that you can get out of that. One is, it's like if you're breaking a KF against a policy team, they are likely to go for the cap K. They're likely to go for framework. So the first question that your KF discussion should answer is, what is my unique answer to framework? What is my unique answer to the cap K, right? The cap K has a variety of link arguments that you could do something about. There are link arguments about individual or localized resistance rather than collective resistance at the level of class. There are link arguments about focusing on identity categories that are not based on class, obfuscating the fact that there are material inequalities rather than identity-based inequalities, right? So if you write a KF, you should try to write a KF that interacts with those arguments in some way. For example, a very successful team against the capitalism critique was Rutgers on the climate topic. And one of their big innovations against the CAPK, well, I don't know how much this is an innovation, but just like something that they did a bunch, was they would read critical affirmatives that spoke to the idea of organizing very directly and very proactively. And they made arguments about the impositions that the world places upon Black women. And they said that when collective action and organizing action is demanded of Black women, that is a violent imposition, because Black women are forced to be productive in ways that are violent and in ways that are not applied to other identity categories. And when someone reads the CAPK, they can immediately apply that concept to the premise of the neg-link argument and be like, what is the implication of your argument that our strategy is suboptimal for organizing? You know, because are you saying that the thing that we are doing is bad because we have not organized enough, and that in order to win we have to meet your standards for how much organizing is sufficient? Are you saying that it is my job as a Black woman to solve capitalism? Why can't you do it? So that kind of discussion was very embedded in the 1AC, and it gave them a unique angle against the CAPK that they could then leverage. Same thing with framework. It's like you can embed various kinds of new tricks. For example, Cal&R was a very effective framework team because they frequently changed their affirmative in ways that had embedded tricks against framework. One affirmative they broke had this idea of autopoiesis, I believe was the term that they used, which was an idea about how like systems manage themselves. And the general idea was like systems are very fluid, very hard to control. They have like an evolutionary logic to them. And when you use framework, you're trying to control that evolutionary logic in a way that is fundamentally impossible. And they had a bunch of cards about this notion in the 1AC, which gave them a really great inbuilt defensive argument against all of the neg's accusations of the AFF exploiting limits, or like, you know, the neg trying to corral down the topic to something manageable through their interpretation. They had an implicit answer to clash, et cetera, et cetera. So kind of the general ideas are the same, which is you need to figure out what the core controversies are. You need to figure out what types of answer critical literature has to the ideas of capitalist organizing comes first and limited topic good, right? And then you go from there, you build your affirmative around that, and then you try to come up with a new twist to throw the neg off guard. That's kind of the formula.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.